Okay, and I do believe we're live, so it's great to be back with you all here today. For those who are new, my name's Nicki. I'm an author and editor, and I post videos here on YouTube about writing, editing, reading, and all the other things I love. And today it is time for my end of the month reading wrap up. For those who are new, this is when I go through all the books I've read during the month, which is usually quite a few, and tell you a little bit about them, what I thought, that kind of thing. It's just a bit of a roundup of all the things I've had going on book-wise during March. I've got quite a few titles to get through, so I will crack on in just a second. Firstly, apologies if you hear the strange musical noise in the background. I actually have a load of washing on, and I was hoping to get this filmed and finished before the washing was done, but I got a bit delayed with a few other things, including putting up the next free chapter of my serialized novel. So it kind of held me up a bit, and now it looks like the washing will finish before I finish on here. So if you hear this weird little do noise, that's just my washing machine, just ignore it. I have shut the doors, so hopefully it won't disturb us too much. Anyway, now I will absolutely get cracking with my roundup, but today I thought I would start. We are a quarter through the year. So just before I talk about the individual books, I just thought I'd do a very quick update on my reading goals and challenges and things like that. So in terms of my reading goals, Goodreads goal for this year is 150 because that's what I always set it at. So far I am at, I think it's about 65. So yeah, I think by the end of April I will be halfway through already, even though we're only a third of the way through the year. So that's looking really good, well ahead of schedule on that one. You may also remember I'm doing an Around the World challenge, which isn't just running this year. I'm just going to keep going with it until I finally finish. And my aim is to read a book written by an author born in every country in the world. For that, I've managed to add one more in March, which is The Daughter's Tale by Armando Lucas Correa from Cuba. And I will be talking about that one in a few minutes because it's on today's list. And finally, my own personal reading challenge, the NJM Book Challenge 2019, has 25 categories, of which I have already completed 22. Of the remaining 3, I have a book lined up for one of them. So that one I will be reading possibly April, otherwise May, just depending on how quickly I get through others. So really, I've just got 2 categories left. One of those is a book with a colour in the title, and the other is a book with an anti-hero. So I still need to find those, but I have 9 more months to go. So I don't think it's going to be a problem to complete the challenge. And I will obviously keep a sharp eye out for suitable contenders to add into those categories. So now that I have waffled on for a few minutes already without actually starting the video proper, I will finally get going. To begin with, I have got a few classics as books that I received as gifts for Christmas and birthday back in December. So I've still been going through a few of those. I'm nearly done, actually. I've got one more to go, which I'm hoping to get to again April or May, depending on timings and things. So, but I've got through 3 of them in March. So the first one is Waverley by Sir Walter Scott. Now, this one, for those who don't know, is set during the final Jacobite uprising, the one which culminated in the Battle of Culloden in 1746, I think. Am I right? 46? Yes, I think so. For those who aren't history buffs, the Jacobite uprisings was an attempt to put the Stuart line of kings back on the throne. At this point, the Hanoverians or the Georges have taken over in England, and there are still contenders for the Stuart line who have been living over on the continent, France and the like. So it's an attempt to try to get rid of the Hanoverians and put the Stuarts back. It does fail. There's been previous ones. I think 1715 was the last big one with the Old Pretender. And then this one in the 1740s is the Young Pretender, Bonnie Prince Charles Edward Stuart. So it's set during that period. Waverley is a young man whose father is a Hanoverian supporter, but whose grandfather is a Jacobite. And he's kind of brought up between the two of them. And he gets a commission eventually in the Hanoverian army as a captain, goes off up to Scotland, but then begins to meet some of his grandfather's friends who are all raging Jacobites. falls in love with the sister of one of them, and gets swept up in the Jacobite uprising. So I don't want to spoiler it too much by telling you what happens to him and how it all works out, but that's the basic premise of the story. And I gave this a 3.5 to 4 stars. I couldn't quite make my mind up. The thing with Walter Scott is he's quite a wordy writer. It's been a little while since I read any of his stuff. I actually find him a little bit more wordy even than, say, Dickens or Henry James, partly because he throws in literary references and the like every 2 seconds. In some ways, it's quite a fun game. I do like to see how many I actually recognise without having to check them. But there are, of course, plenty that I do have to check because they're quoting works that just aren't popular. They were popular at the time Scott was writing, but they haven't really come down to us in the 21st century so much, so I hadn't read them. And I had to check what the quote was referring to and get the meaning behind it. So that's quite laborious, having to keep flicking back and forth. But to me, the main thing that stopped me giving this 4 stars was not that, because that doesn't really bother me, that you kind of expect that a lot from the classics. But it was Waverley as a character. I just didn't like him very much. He was just a bit of a twat. I'm sorry, but he was. He's had this like ridiculous upbringing that hasn't prepared him for life at all. He's got all these really romantic ideals, and he goes off, and every single decision he makes, you're just wanting to yell at him, for goodness sake, you're being a complete idiot. Don't do that. Don't say that. And so he just annoyed me a little bit as a character, which is why I hovered between the 3.5 to the 4. But, you know, other than that, though, it is a good story. It's interesting from an historical perspective if you want to read a book set in the Jacobite uprising. So, yeah, I'd recommend it, but probably for only really die-hard classics fans. If you're not into having to keep flicking back and forth to the note section and things like that, then this probably isn't one for you. Moving on. 3 Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. So another classic, which, like Waverley, I hadn't gotten to yet. It's been on my list for a while. And I gave this one 4 stars. The premise of this book, for those who don't know, is that a group of friends, all of whom are having various sort of midlife crises in a way, decide they want to get away for a bit of boy time, if you like. And they take a boat out on the Thames to travel up the river. And various escapades and things happen to them along the way. It was really funny. It was a really quick read. Some of the humour, I got all the humour, but some of it is very dated. So if you're not particularly familiar with the time period, books from that era and that kind of thing, then you might struggle with getting why some of it's meant to be funny. But it didn't bother me. I thought it was amusing. Some of the jokes nowadays and some of the things they say we would decide are not quite politically correct, but you just have to read it and keep the period in mind of when it was written. That was perfectly fine. So yeah, if you want a classic that's a much easier going prose, a much lighter read, and you don't mind a few outdated jokes, then this is probably one to check out. Next up, we have The Jungle Books by Rudyard Kipling. Kipling is always a little bit of a difficult author in some ways because of his views, shall we say, on empire and the British Raj and things like that. But I don't think that comes across as strongly in The Jungle Books as in some of his other writing, so it's less of an issue in this work. Obviously, with The Jungle Book, it's the stories about Mowgli that we know best because of the Disney and all the other versions. However, I did quite enjoy some of the other stories in the collection as well. Obviously, Rikki Tikki Tavi is one that people do know as well, reasonably well. But there were some other good ones that I hadn't actually heard of before and come across before. So it was a good collection. They were all pretty straightforward, simple, easy little reads. And this is one of those classics where you can start to introduce perhaps slightly older children to them as well. So this was a 4-star for me. Moving on, and I think turning the page, perhaps I should show you, I've got here my sort of list of all the books. And so as I acquire a new book that I need to read, I add it to the list. But obviously I'm not necessarily reading them in the exact order that I added to the list, which is why I'm jumping around up and down on the pages a bit, looking for all the ones that I've written March next to. So as we move along, okay, the next piece is The Lady Raven. by Rebecca Henry. This is a book that I received from the author. She was looking for reviewers. And it is a dark retelling of Cinderella. This one I struggled with a little. I gave it 2.5 stars in the end. And I'd like to say first off that I liked the idea. I thought the idea behind the story worked well. It had some real potential. However, the prose wasn't that great. It was full of errors, or like not just one or two. I'm talking, you know, a substantial amount that makes it worth commenting on. And this was a finished, finalized copy. It wasn't one I was getting as an advanced review copy. It's one that's already been published several months ago. So it was a final copy I was reading, and it was riddled with problems that my editor, my internal editor, wanted to go through and scribble on red pen all over. And that kind of ruined it for me, because I was thinking that on every page, and every 2 seconds I was being pulled out of the story because there was something wrong. So if that kind of thing doesn't worry you and you just enjoy fairy tale retellings, then you'll probably find something to like about this book. As I said, it did have potential with the story and the characters. It's just that the prose let it down for me. Next up is a NetGalley read, and it's We Must Be Brave by Frances Liardet, or Liardet. I'm not sure how we're saying it. Bear with me on that one. And this is an historical fiction piece. It's set during the Second World War, during the Blitz, and it's about a woman, a childless woman. She and her husband have a marriage. They don't have sex at all, essentially. He was injured during the previous war, and he's essentially unable. So he tells her that before their marriage, and she says she's fine with it. But then one day she's on the bus, and there's an evacuation from the town because of bombing, and she finds a child on the back seat. No one to claim the child. So she ends up taking her home, and she ends up becoming really attached to her, and she has no children of her own. And she really wants to keep the child, but eventually the parents, or one of the parents anyway, is found. So it was a really well-written story. I'd like to say that first. Absolutely well-written. Very nice prose, easy reading, good pacing of the story as well. For me, though, I only gave it 3 stars, but that's just because personally it didn't touch me. And I don't know whether this is just because I don't really have much of a maternal instinct myself, but I honestly just got a bit annoyed with the woman, and I couldn't understand why she was getting so like worked up about this child. Like, you found the parents, give the child back, you know, what's the problem? The child, and particularly for me, because the child was really annoying. She did nothing but cause trouble and complain. And if it was me, I'd just be like really happy to have finally been rid of her. So I think because of that, I found it really difficult to connect with the heroine and to really understand why she was doing and feeling the things that she was. Because for me, it would have just been the complete opposite. But as I said, that 3 stars is really just because of my personal inability to connect with the characters. But it is a really well-written book. So for other people, this is probably a 4, maybe a 5-star read. So I just wanted to make that clear. There was absolutely nothing wrong with the writing. It was just a personal thing for me that it just wasn't for me. Next up, we have Slammed Into You by C.M. Valencourt. This is one, or Valencourt, depending on if we're pronouncing it in a French way or an English way. So this is one I received as a review copy from the author. They approached me to read it. It's a new release, and it's an a gay romance contemporary piece. The title Slammed Into You comes from the fact that it's set in the world of slam poetry competitions. And our 2 main characters they meet and essentially become rivals. They both want to outdo each other in the field of slam poetry. However, there's plenty of sexual interest going on between them underneath all that antagonism. So I don't want to give too much away about the story, but it is essentially an enemies to lovers trope. And I thought this was really enjoyable. It was really good fun. I liked the characters. I thought their relationship was believable. It didn't feel too much like insta-love, and it didn't feel like the change between them in terms of their relationship happened too quickly. It was a sort of slowly developed thing. So it worked really well, and for me, it was a 4-star read. moving on to The Daughter's Tale, the one I mentioned earlier for my Around the World Reading Challenge. This one is by Armando Lucas Correa, and for me it was a 3.5-star read. This is historical fiction again. It's set again during the Second World War, and this one is, it's kind of connected to the Holocaust and to the concentration camps. And this is really hard because I really don't want to spoil the story of this one, because it would kind of ruin it if I gave too much away. For me, though, the only thing I can say is it was let down a bit by the ending. I had no trouble with the prose, with the characters, with the story for the most part. But for me, there just wasn't anything very satisfying about the ending. It felt a bit sudden and abrupt, and it just kind of like cut off and that's that then kind of thing. I kind of expected a bit more after such a slow, long build-up. I had thought we'd get a little bit more from it than we did, which is why I gave it 3.5 stars. If not for that, it probably would have been a 4. Next up, that was a NetGalley read too, I should say. I think I forgot to mention that. And another NetGalley read now, The Art of Visual Note-Taking by Emily Mills. This is a book that just the title and the cover jumped out at me, and when I saw it on NetGalley, and I decided to have a look and see what it was about. And it did sound quite interesting. And it's based around the idea of, if you're, say, in a lecture or such, you want to take some notes at a conference, it's a way of combining your notes in a sort of visual drawing sense, rather than just pages and pages of scribble. I really liked the idea. I don't know how well it would work for me, because I am quite a scribbler. And because I'm a bit of a perfectionist too, I think for me, taking notes in that way in a conference or something, when I had to get stuff down quick, I think that would be too hard, because I'd be worried the drawings weren't good enough. And I mean, it kind of says, don't worry about that and you'll get better over time. But I am such a perfectionist, that would be hard for me. However, I do like the idea of it in terms of doing it as a nice way to commemorate, say, a holiday, where you do it after the event and you've got time to sit and plan out and really make the drawings nice. And that would be a nice sort of spread you could do in your bullet journal about your trip you took. So from that point of view, I really liked it. I would have liked more of examples of those things in the book. The author did mention using it for that purpose too, but pretty much all the examples were about note-taking in conferences and meetings and things. And I did mention that in my review, and she did respond to me and she said, oh, absolutely. And she said she's going to put up a few more examples from that kind of thing on her website, on her blog, which is nice. So I think I might give it a try, perhaps when I next go on a trip, because I definitely liked the idea in principle. But for me personally, I don't think it would work in that spur of the moment meeting setting. But I gave this book a 4 stars. It was really fun. I liked the idea of it, and it was nicely presented with some good examples and some great tips. Sticking with a sort of artistic bent, if you like, the next book is Beginning Pen and Ink by Desarae Lee, which is another NetGalley read. I mostly work in pencil in art. It's my preferred medium, particularly graphite pencil, just no colour, just plain black and white, if you like. And I am interested in the idea of trying to expand, and ink would probably be the next step for me, because it doesn't involve buying a lot of expensive paints and other materials and things like that. And obviously it's a bit less messy. I'm not a person who enjoys mess. So moving on to pen ink drawing would be a thing for me, which is why I wanted to check this book out. I gave it 4 stars. I think it was a really good overview. It offered some tips, some advice, both on materials, techniques and things like that. I still haven't given it a go, simply because I don't know where I'm going to find the time. I mean, there's so many things I'd like to do. I'd like to practice my music more. I'd like to do more art. And yet my days just seem to fly by. By the time I've done all the computer stuff, all my sort of work, all the household stuff. I mean, I have a fairly large house here that has to be cleaned all the time. You barely clean it and my husband arrives home and creates mess again. So it's like an ongoing thing. In fact, there's a song in the musical Mozart, Austrian musical, and the lines about how a housewife's work is never ended, and it's very true. But anyway, enough of my woes. But it does mean that I haven't done any drawing really at all since the beginning of the year, I don't think, and I have wanted to do one, and it's just, I have got books coming out, I've got other stuff I'm working on, I'm trying to get back into my writing after a bit of a slump last year, so there's just so many other things going on, but I will give it a try eventually, and this book was definitely a really nice introduction to that. So moving swiftly on, the next couple of books are ones I picked up secondhand in a sale at the City State Library. This was back in February, I think. And the first of these is Twilight of the Habsburgs by Alan Palmer. So it's a non-fiction history book about Franz Josef, essentially, one of the last major, really, Habsburg ruler in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it's interesting. I gave it 4.5 stars. I thought it was a very balanced work that really sort of looked at things from both perspectives. And I found it particularly interesting because I've read a lot of biographies and information about Sissy, his wife, Elizabeth. And Franz Josef in that tends to be a little bit of a shadowy character in some ways. The focus tends to be on Sissy's relationship with his mother, Sophie, and on her relationship with the court in general. And he becomes this kind of figure in the background. So it was very interesting to read things more from his point of view, where Sissy becomes that background figure. And we get a few more insights into his political choices and that kind of thing. So I liked that. One thing that really bugs me in these biographies, excuse me a second, I just need a quick drink. When there are English language biographies of Sissy, and in this case Franz Josef, they keep anglicising the names and it drives me insane. His name is Franz Josef. There's nothing difficult about Franz Josef. And yet they insist on changing it in the book to Francis Joseph, which it just sounds weird to me. It just sounds wrong and bizarre. They leave Ludwig alone because they decide that Ludwig sounds stupid in English. But Franz Josef sounds stupid in English too. Just leave it alone. And they change Elizabeth to the spelling with a Z to make it English. And I mean, what's the point of that? And it just really bugs me. And every time I see the name on the page, which you obviously see quite a lot in a biography about the guy, it just grates at me. There's absolutely no reason why an English audience can't manage to say Franz Josef, or they don't even have to say it, they only have to read it. It's not that difficult, and I don't think it's that complex German that it's really a problem. So that bugs me no end, which is why it got 4.5 stars and not 5. But this was a good biography. It was informative, it was nicely balanced, and I did enjoy reading it and just getting a different perspective on events that I'd already read about from a different person's point of view. Moving on, the next book I picked up at that event was Le Quatrième Mur by Sorj Chalendon. So this is a book in French, which I picked up mostly just for French practice, to be honest. It's probably not a book I would have picked up based on the blurb had it been in English. Hehowever, I did end up enjoying the story. I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was a really thought-provoking piece. It's about a man who is he's French, and one of his friends is a Greek Jew. And this guy, they're all activists to some level or another, but this Greek Jew decides, it's set during the war in Libya in the 1980s, and he decides he wants to go and do a production of Antigone over in Libya in the middle of the war, to have a ceasefire, have actors drawn from all sides of the conflict to come together and play roles in this piece. Unfortunately, he becomes ill, and he manages to get this friend, George, to agree to go in his place and put on this production and organise everything. So George, who's got a wife and young child, he leaves them in France and goes over to Libya and encounters a lot of problems. He's trying to meet all the actors. He's ended up in the middle of this war zone, which is worse than he'd expected. Things that he was told were in place for this production are not in place. And there are a lot of trials and tribulations. And I mean, I don't want to give the ending away, but it is quite a sad piece. As I said, very thought-provoking. Because this war was happening when I was literally just being born pretty much. I was only a few years old and things. So I don't really know much about this. I was too young to follow it on the news and things like that. So it was interesting to hear a bit more about it. And I thought the story idea was a good one. It was nicely paced. I liked the characters. And overall, this was a really good read. And I enjoyed it too, because I actually managed to read the entire thing without looking in the dictionary. I didn't actually know all the words, but I knew enough that I could work out what was meant by any words that I didn't recognize straight up. I could infer what that word was. And I managed to read the entire thing and understand it all and that fine without the dictionary. So that was good for my French. A good bit of practice. And yeah, I gave it 4 stars because it was a good story too. And sticking with these books bought in that sale is The Buccaneers by Edith Wharton. Now, if any of you watched my video yesterday about the TV I've been watching during March, you'll know that I also looked up the old adaptation of this book that was on the BBC back in the mid-90s. And this book is actually the TV tying edition. So it has Edith Wharton's original text up as far as it went before she died. And then the rest of it is a novelization written based on the TV series, which they kind of based the TV series on a synopsis that Wharton had left behind, but it was a very brief synopsis, so it didn't give them a lot of detail. They kind of knew how it ended, but not really how they got there. So they had free reign. And I didn't always agree with what they did. If I'm just talking about Edith Wharton's story, I think it's a fun story. I like the characters. I love the idea behind it. In terms of how it ended, I think that the TV version skewed things very much towards Nan's perspective. They wanted to make Nan a sympathetic character. And to do that, they had to make Julius, her husband, the Duke, a less sympathetic character. So they made him gay. And this never quite sat right with me because, okay, perhaps he was gay. It's possible. You know, they do have a slightly strained relationship, Julius and Nan. And he's a slightly uptight person. He's obsessed with fixing clocks. But that doesn't necessarily mean he's gay, you know. And I felt that they made him gay simply because it gave readers or watchers an excuse to go, oh, well, you know, it's understandable she'd want to run off with a lover then and leave him because, you know, he was gay. And so they had no future relationship. It wasn't going to work between them. But I thought that was a bit of a cop-out, really, because I actually like Julius as a character. He's not perfect. He has lots of flaws, but he's not a bad man. And in fact, one thing I did like, which is I think a bit they wrote for the TV after the cut-off of the story by Edith Wharton. I'd have to check to remember that. Trying to remember exactly where it cut off and the new bit started. But at one point, he says, you know, my mother wants me to drag you back regardless. And she says, why don't you then? And he says, because I'm not a monster. And I think that sums Julius up perfectly. He's not a bad person. His upbringing has left him with quite a few character flaws. He's very much dominated by his mother. He's an only son, and she's been grooming him to take over as the Duke, you know, since he was a child. So he's never really had a proper life, and he's never really got to know people. But he's not a bad person. He's not a horrible person. And I think that the story, the way they did it, in some ways just skewed it to try and make it more reasonable for Nan to have taken a lover and run off with him, which I didn't quite appreciate all the time, but that's just me. Overall, though, as I said, I'm giving it 5 stars because if I'm just judging it on Edith Wharton's part, and we'll just say I ignore how the TV series decided to take things and end it, then I think it was really good fun. And it's one of those lighter classics. It's not heavy-going reading. Anyone could pick this up, even if they're not a big fan of the classics, and read and enjoy it. It's very straightforward, easy prose. Next up is a book I received as an ARC from Pan Macmillan, Australia. This is Gingerbread by Helen Oyeyemi. I hope I said that pronunciation correctly. This was a 4-star read for me. It's actually a really hard one to describe because it's kind of this magical realism. It's a really lyrical piece, but it kind of weaves in and out of all these different ideas. It doesn't really, in some ways it has a beginning, a middle and an end, but it's a little bit confused and muted, the way it works. Essentially, it's kind of this blend of fairy tale and realism, and this idea of gingerbread is kind of woven through all these narratives. And the main characters come from this place that some people believe exists, but most people think is just an imaginary world. And I mean, it is, as you can hear, it's kind of super hard to describe, particularly when I'm trying to describe it without giving anything away that would ruin it for readers. All I'd say in the end on this one is I gave it 4 stars, and I would recommend it if you like sort of a really heavy magical realism works, where you're perhaps not always entirely sure of what's going on and what to believe about what's happening. So it's something a little bit different, very lyrical. So if that's your style of book, then I would recommend it. Moving along, the next book I read takes us back to NetGalley, and it's Harmony of Fire and Earth by Antonia Aquilante. And this is the second book in a duology. The first book in the series, in the 2-parter that I read, I gave 5 stars to, I think, from memory. It was either 4 or 5. I think it was 5. And I really loved it. I loved the setting. It's an fantasy action romance. And I really loved the concept behind the story. I thought it worked so well. I adored the characters. I liked that their relationship developed slowly and believably. It wasn't just this major insta-love. And I was really excited to see how this story would finish. However, I could only give the second book 3.5 stars. It just didn't feel as good as the first. I thought the pacing was slightly off. There were bits that were really great fun, but then there were bits that were really slow and full of dialogue and didn't feel like they advanced the story much. I enjoyed the second relationship that developed between 2 new characters in this one that carried on alongside the 2 original characters' romance. But it was just the pacing, I think. I keep feeling like I need to sneeze, so I probably will in a minute, but I apologise. I'll try not to. Overall, anyway, I'd give the series 4 stars between the 2 books, but book 1 was definitely better than the second. I just think the pacing in the second let it down. The end's in sight. We've got 3 to go. And next up is another NetGalley read, which is a biography of Tussaud by Geri Walton. This was a really interesting piece. I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was good. However, it's well known that a lot of Madame Tussaud's life is a little bit of a blank book. We don't know a lot. There's huge periods when we don't really know what she was doing, where she was. And the author of this book kind of filled those in with background information on major historical events at the time, which is probably interesting if you don't know anything about it. But this book's taking place in the French Revolution, and I have an entire bookshelf dedicated to the French Revolution and another entire bookshelf dedicated just to books from Robespierre. So it's an era I know pretty well. All these major events are very familiar to me, and therefore I kind of found myself skimming through the descriptions of them because it wasn't new information for me. I just kind of skimmed through those and then got to the bit when our main heroine, if you like, Madame Tussaud, made an appearance, and read about her. And then there was another historical event described, so I flicked through that. So it's probably interesting if you don't know a lot about the background, because it does fill in the gaps. But in some ways, to me, it felt a bit like filler, because we didn't have enough to say about her on our own, and we kind of had to fill in a bit of a word count with all this background stuff. So that's why it didn't get 5 stars for me. I think I gave it 4 because I thought if you don't know anything about these events, then it would be interesting and helpful perhaps to get that background and see what's going on in her life, like in the world around her. But for me, that was just unnecessary information. So it probably depends on your background, how you're going to respond to this book. But certainly she's such a well-known figure that I'm sure the biography will appeal to a lot of people who have perhaps visited one of the waxworks museums and want to know a bit more about the woman behind it all. Next up is another NetGalley read, and this is another non-fiction book. It's called For the Love of Books by Graham Tarrant. And essentially this is a book full of facts about books, about reading, about authors, and it's set out roughly in terms of talking about different genres, but essentially it is just a collection of fun anecdotes. I gave this 4 stars. There were lots of fun facts. Some of them I knew, some I didn't. And obviously the latter I found interesting to learn. However, once or twice the author started to inject personal opinions, which rubbed me up the wrong way, essentially. I mean, one of them, he was complaining that no famous authors win the Nobel Prize for Literature. It's all these random authors that no one's heard of. But one of those random authors no one's heard of that he decided to list was Halldór Laxness, who is actually one of my favourite authors. If you watch these reading wrap-up videos, you probably will have heard me talk about him before, because I've read a number of his books, and I'm still trying to catch up in the few that have been translated that I haven't gotten to yet. He's an author I adore, so of course I have heard of him. So picking him as one of the obscure authors wasn't the best way to go. And I think that would always be the case, because, yeah, sure, perhaps the everyday Joe blogs on the street might not have heard of every single one of them, but serious readers probably have tried at least 1 or 2 of them. So I thought that was a little bit misjudged, as was a later comment he made when he kind of seemed to be accusing all self-published authors of putting out books that are unedited and badly written. And that kind of rubbed me up the wrong way too, because as a qualified freelance editor myself, I work a lot with indie authors, all of whom are coming to me to get their books edited before they go out. I know a lot of indie authors, and none of them, of my personal acquaintance, would put out a book that wasn't edited. What level of editing it has might depend on their budgets, on who they get to do it, but I don't know anyone who just puts out a book without it having been looked over by someone. So I thought that was a little bit of an unfair judgment on self-publishing, and probably a slightly dated view on it as well. It doesn't suggest he knows much about the current self-publishing scene. I think if he'd kept some of those personal thoughts out of the book, it would have been better. But I still gave it 4 stars because it was a really a fun collection of facts that's going to appeal to book lovers out there who, or perhaps if you want to buy a book for a book lover and you don't know what they've read and you're umming and ahhing what to get, this might be a good option as just a sort of general read about their hobby. And that brings us to the final book of the month, which is The Whispering Muse by Sjón, who's another of my favourite Icelandic authors. And after Halldór Laxness, I think I like Halldór Laxness best, but they are very different. They both have a very different prose style, so I don't think you can particularly judge them against one another. Sjón's work is incredibly lyrical, a lot of magical realism, and all that kind of thing going on. So this particular work, The Whispering Muse, is set on a boat, essentially, and one of the crew on the boat, it turns out, is actually someone who was on the journey with Jason and the Argonauts to get the Golden Fleece. So in between the stuff that's happening on this journey, every night this crew member sits and recounts from his point of view some of the events that happened during that famous voyage. And there's a lot of sort of symbolism and strange happenings going on, people turning into birds and all sorts of things. Again, I can't really say too much about it without spoiling it. So all I will say is just a really lyrical, magical realism story, a really fun idea. So if that's your kind of thing, then I will check it out. I gave it 4.5 stars. It's not my absolute favourite work of his, but it was still really enjoyable. And so that brings us to the end for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. My throat is getting dry, so I think it's a good chance, good thing we're stopping now. But looking ahead into April, I've got 2 book reviews to write up this morning, which will go out during April. So I will talk about those next time. I'm up to date with all my NetGalley and ebook reads at the moment, unless anything has come through on my email this morning, which I haven't had a chance to check yet before doing this stream. So what I've got at the moment is, I think I've got about 6 or 7 print books that are sitting on my table waiting. I'm going to start with The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I'll begin that tonight. And then I'll be sharing that one with you, my thoughts on that one next time. And I've got a few others sitting there waiting as well. So it's always nice when you kind of feel you've got a few things in your TBR pile to look forward to, but it's not so huge that it's intimidating you. So anyway, I will end there because I'm now waffling and I should get on because it is nearly 10 o'clock here and I have lots to do with my day. So I will end there. I will be back again very soon with another vlog. Next weekend, I will be visiting Alina's channel for our monthly genre talk. And in this one, we'll be discussing Naomi Novik's Temeraire series, the first book, His Majesty's Dragon, as one of our sort of read-along discussions. So I do hope you will join us for that. And I'll be back again later in April with my usual round of vlogs. So bye for now, everyone. I'll see you all again very soon.